Bonjour. My name is John Scott. I am a lawyer in Scotland. I'm a Queen's Counsel solicitor advocate. And I chaired a review which was commissioned by the Scottish Government to look at the impact on communities in Scotland of the policing of the miners' strike between 1984 and 1985. And that was a strike throughout the United Kingdom. But my review only looked at the impact on communities in Scotland. The review was set up by the Scottish Government, and their jurisdiction only extends to Scotland. I have been working as a lawyer for over 30 years. I have chaired some reviews, independent reviews, asked to do so by the Scottish Government into aspects of policing in Scotland, and I've been doing that since about 2015. I had chaired a review into the use of stop and search powers by police in Scotland. I chaired a review into the use of biometrics, DNA, fingerprints, and so forth in Scotland. And then this review on the impact on communities of the policing of the miners' strike. So I was already used to working with a number of other people, academics, practitioners, people who knew the subject inside out, and others who brought other skills to it. The terms of reference I looked at and revised and then agreed, and that's obviously how it should happen. When someone is chairing a review, they should be responsible for the terms of reference, and certainly for agreeing the terms of reference, and I did that. And an important part of the reason behind it was to see if there could be any healing of the still palpable scars on, in particular, mining communities in Scotland, and a healing of the rift between police officers who are part of our communities and the miners and their families, who are obviously also part of our communities. The strike was a long time ago, 1984 to 1985. I was myself 20 and then 21 at the time and at university. But the strike was a big thing in the whole of the United Kingdom and in Scotland, perhaps in Scotland in particular. So it's something that was part of the national consciousness. And whenever the strike is mentioned, the very strong feelings that continue are very obvious. And there was a lot of bitterness towards the police on the part of mining communities and indeed others, and a lot of bitterness towards the United Kingdom government. The Scottish government didn't exist at the time. The Scottish Parliament was set up only in 1999, and therefore it was looking at, through me, things which happened before it came into existence. But it was thought that it was sufficiently important that a review was needed. I should say that at the United Kingdom level, there have been attempts to get a full public inquiry into the miners' strike, including the policing of the miners' strike, including the action of the UK government. But efforts over many years for such a public inquiry have been unsuccessful. There have also been attempts to have an inquiry into events at Orgreave. That is one of the most infamous parts of the strike that happened in England. It did involve miners from Scotland travelling there, and the policing of that event is something that has seen continued campaigning for an independent review. But again, although it was mentioned to us in our work, it wasn't something which we could look at or look at directly. I had never worked on anything to do with the miners' strike before. I hadn't directly worked with anyone in mining communities. I am a citizen of Scotland. I'm a lawyer. I was a young man at the time of the strike. But I suppose I was asked to chair the review because I've got a long background in doing human rights work, not only as a lawyer, but also in the voluntary sector. I've been the convener of the Scottish Human Rights Centre previously, and then the Howard League for Penal Reform in Scotland, and also Justice Scotland. So I have become known for doing quite a lot of work in human rights. And obviously, as I said earlier, since 2015, I have been doing work looking at various aspects of policing in Scotland, but through a human rights lens. So that's why I think I was asked to do it. I had, during the course of my work on previous reviews, offered various criticisms of policing and of government, and was seen as an independent person who could apply his mind to the evidence, to try to find evidence and then to consider it. But not to do that alone. I was accompanied by 3 colleagues on the review team. Dennis Canavan, who is a former member of the Westminster Parliament, who is a former member of the Scottish Parliament, who for a long time was a member of the Labour Party, and then after a number of years became an independent member of the Scottish Parliament, and who is from a mining community and had long had an interest in the miners' strike and had raised it in his different representative roles. Kate Thomson was a retired, or is a retired, Deputy Chief Constable at Police Scotland, and was able to give us insight into and links into policing networks. So Dennis was a conduit into mining networks and communities, and Kate was similarly a conduit into policing networks and communities. And that was important because these were the 2 key communities that we wanted to engage with, to hear from, and to record evidence from. And each was trusted in their own area. And then the final member of the team was Professor Jim Murdoch from Glasgow University, my old university. And he was, as a much younger man, one of my lecturers. And Jim has done a lot of work with the Committee for the Prevention of Torture, and brought an independent academic gaze to what we were considering. And each of my colleagues on the review team made enormous contributions. The work would not have been the same, could not have been done without each of them. And I remain extremely grateful to them for the knowledge, experience, and wisdom that each of them brought to our work. So we were all aware of the miners' strike, all being Scottish, having lived in Scotland at the time at different stages of our different careers. But the miners' strike was something that cut across all sections of the community in Scotland. And I remember The Justice Secretary at the time, who asked me to carry out this work, Michael Matheson, he spoke about how as a young boy he was aware of the lorries, for example, that were an obvious part of the miners' strike. It was fairly obvious to me, and this is all before the pandemic, and it can be hard at times now to think about taking evidence or meeting people other than on camera. But this was before the pandemic, and we realised, we had our first meeting, in fact, at Glasgow University, where we spoke to Dr. Jim Phillips, an expert in the miners' strike. And it was clear to us, we couldn't just sit back in offices in Edinburgh or Glasgow or wherever and wait for people to come to us with their evidence. We would have a call for evidence. We received many responses to that, and that's a traditional way of working when it comes to reviews. But we also thought that there's some of the evidence we'll only get if we go out into mining communities and if we go out to meet people who were police officers at the time. So that's what we arranged to do. And through Jim McBriarty, who was at the time president of the Retired Police Officers Association of Scotland, we had meetings with retired police officers of all ranks, up to and including 2 chief constables who were in place at the time in different parts of the country, but also officers who were on the front line. And we had a very useful and illuminating meeting with them. And we, through Nicky Wilson, who's president of the National Union of Mine Workers in Scotland, we arranged a number of meetings in mining communities throughout Scotland. I wanted some guidance from Nicky on the best time of day to have these reviews. I'm a lawyer, and that's my day job, but I realised that I had to go where and when the evidence would be available. So I wondered whether daytime meetings might be useful, but Nicky pointed out that many of the people who were involved in the strike are in fact still working. They've found other jobs. Many of them didn't find other work, and that I'll come back to, but many of them were working. So actually evening meetings were better. So we arranged our meetings for early evening, started around about 6 o'clock, and we had them in community centres. We had them in, there was one in a pub, and in miners' halls as well. And this was right across Scotland. And at these meetings, we heard the evidence of miners, miners' wives, children, grandchildren, councillors, others in the community that were affected. There was also a retired police officer who was the son and grandson of a miner who came along to one of the meetings. In fact, a retired deputy chief constable came along to one of the meetings as well. Some of the meetings were attended by dozens and dozens of people at the Mining Museum in Midlothian. It was a large crowd, and we needed to use microphones for that. And other meetings were much smaller meetings. Our very first meeting in Cumnock, we were booked for the town hall. It was a large venue that could have easily accommodated dozens of people. And in fact, there were perhaps a dozen to 20 people who attended. And what we did then is we simply pulled the chairs round in a circle. We were able to introduce ourselves. Everyone in the room was able to introduce themselves, and we had a conversation that was able to go into much more depth and detail than those meetings with dozens of people where you want to try to make sure, and I did my best to make sure that everyone who wanted to say something had their say, but that can't be done in the same level of detail. So it actually worked really well for us that we had meetings, some of which had large numbers and some of which had smaller numbers. And we heard a depth and quality of evidence at some of the smaller meetings, which we would not otherwise have heard. And our experience in these meetings over the winter, end of the year into the early part of the new year when it happened, was that those who attended the meetings were very generous with their time. They were very generous in sharing their experience. There was a lot of bitterness still. There was a lot of upset. Some of these meetings were extremely emotional, very moving and affecting. And some people were sharing things that they hadn't shared with anyone for a long time. We saw miners who hadn't met some of their old friends for a long time getting together at some of the meetings and speaking amongst themselves, but they did share their stories with us. And the power in what we heard from the miners, their families and communities, and also the police officers truly affected us. And it meant that this review was more than just a dry review of facts and figures, of dates in history, of when particular events took place, of the numbers who were arrested. It was much, much more than that. This was the personal stories and the impact on individuals. And obviously our remit was to look at the impact on communities, but communities are made of individuals. And so in hearing more of the impact on these many individuals, we started to see and understand the impact on their communities and Scotland as a whole. So there was a great power in what we heard. Many things that were being described to us happened so long ago that people were relying simply on their own memory. Some people have got better memories than others. Some had paperwork that assisted with parts of what they could recall. Some men were dead and members of their family came and shared their stories. Some were old or infirm or unable to attend. And again, families came and spoke for them, and we heard from children and grandchildren who shared the stories. I may say some of the stories were very funny as well. Some of the things that happened would be very entertaining in a film, but the overwhelming evidence we heard was of sadness, of serious effect and impact, of bitterness, and of lasting scars. The miners in particular were wary, or some of them were wary to start off with, because there have been campaigns for a public inquiry for a long time, and they didn't know me. And they didn't know my colleagues, although many of them knew Dennis Canavan. So that, I think, helped us, because for all of us, our reputations are massively important. In your career as a lawyer, it's the most important thing, your reputation and how you conduct yourself to maintain that. So none of us would associate ourselves with something which was going to be a cover-up or anything like that at all. But some of the people we spoke to thought that we were establishment figures and not necessarily there to offer them anything better than they'd already had, which was mostly nothing. Police officers were wary too. The the thing that was mentioned to us by police officers was Hillsborough, the Hillsborough disaster, and the you'll recall the footballing disaster in England, and various inquiries into that, and also prosecutions. And from the policing community, the concern was that this was an attempt to target individuals, to scapegoat, or even potentially to have people prosecuted. Now, none of that was within our remit. That was not the intention. And this length of time on it would simply have been impossible anyway, I think. So we had to make sure that people trusted us as far as we could. The main way that that develops is when people see what you say in your report. Until that point, I think the trust is qualified trust or conditional trust, because some people may say one thing and do another. And so the test of your of whether you can be trusted is whether you do what you say you will do. And the main thing we said we would do, and we did, was to listen and to capture the evidence we heard, to reflect it in our report, and then to make a recommendation or recommendations based on that reflected matters as fairly as we could. So we weren't immediately accepted as people that had the best of intentions and were to be trusted, but over time that developed. And we were challenged at meetings as well, I should say, that people questioned us, and when we, as we did, relayed to police officers things we'd heard from mining communities, or when we relayed to mining communities things we'd heard from police officers, sometimes there was a reaction, and sometimes there was a very strong reaction. People certainly did not always accept what was said by those that they saw as being on the other side of the dispute. But that was one of the things, it was easier to do that than to try and arrange a joint meeting, because I think some of the wounds were still too raw to allow that to happen, although it happened a little in a couple of meetings. When I mentioned that there was a retired detective chief constable who attended, and he spoke, and the retired officer who was the son and grandson of miners, and he spoke as well. Well, the trauma we faced was the trauma of individuals. And it is clear to me that some individuals were deeply traumatized by the strike, and that's on all sides of it. So miners who were charged, prosecuted, sacked, and some of whom never worked again, some of whom, because of their conviction, either didn't go abroad or didn't think about going abroad because they thought their conviction would stop them doing that. On the policing side, there was an officer who spoke very movingly of gathering his thoughts before our meeting, and then one night when asleep, waking up, having had a nightmare and a flashback to the events of the strike. It was clear that there was a trauma experienced by people on all hands of the dispute. Pardonnez-moi. I was talking about the trauma that we experienced or faced, and it was the trauma in the individuals who gave evidence to us and had to think back to the awful things which had happened. And one of the things that struck us was that the trauma experienced by, on the one hand, the miners and their families, but especially the miners on picket lines, and the police officers also very often on picket lines, was very similar trauma. These were mostly young men who had not necessarily wanted to be either on strike or policing the strike, facing each other across sometimes a fairly narrow road down which heavy lorries would speed. And there were some frightening moments. And we heard about that from others who were not directly involved in the strike, but we heard from a chaplain and heard from politicians who were along sometimes to witness what was happening and to describe what sounded at times very frightening. So there was trauma, and the trauma felt in particular by miners who were arrested and prosecuted, convicted, and then lost their jobs. And the ones who couldn't find their jobs again, there was the trauma of that loss, the trauma of the loss of a good name. We spoke with many men who had never been in any trouble at all before, who were never in any trouble subsequently, but felt that through fighting for not only their own jobs, but for a whole industry, that they had lost their good name, and there was a trauma attached to that. Families broke up, there were suicides, and the lasting impacts of that trauma could still be seen and heard. I'm asked if we faced any legal or political obstacles, and my answer to that is no. We were an independent review. I was the independent chair of the review, and having been commissioned, what we put into the report and what we recommended was entirely a matter for us. We had conversations in which we tested, in which we sounded people out about possible recommendations, but the recommendations were entirely for us. And as a group, we agreed on the single recommendation unanimously. Well, we wanted this to be a meaningful review. I said at the start that there had already been, for many years, campaigning for a public inquiry into the whole of the miners' strike across the United Kingdom. And indeed, the Scottish government had asked the United Kingdom government to establish a review like that. But because the United Kingdom government, the fact that it's a Conservative government and has been since 2010, made it all the less likely that there would be any thought, any serious thought given to such an inquiry or review in the United Kingdom, the Scottish government decided that something needed to be done. And taking our steer from that, we considered the possibility of a recommendation that there should be a full UK public inquiry, but thought that adding our recommendation to the voices of the many who had already asked for that, including the Scottish government, would have little impact. And in particular, it would have little impact for the men and women and children that we spoke to during the course of our work. So on that basis, we decided not to make that recommendation, which might have been the obvious recommendation for us to make, because there was a limit to what we could tell from the evidence. We were presented sometimes with different accounts of the same or similar events, and we're not in a position to resolve the contradictions or the conflicts one way or another, but we simply recorded those areas where there was consensus, where there was agreement, or at least where there was no contradiction. And there were many of those. And actually during our work, there was a sense that the policing community sympathised with the mining community, and some in the mining community sympathised with the police in having to do their job. Many thought that on the mining side, thought that the true villains were the United Kingdom government, and that was personalised to particular individuals within the then United Kingdom government, not least the Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher. So the communities lent into each other a bit, and that was something that we observed rather than created or caused. And mindful of the idea that this was, if at all possible, to be an exercise in reconciliation. So truth and reconciliation was mentioned. We recorded as fully as we could what truth we could find, or truths, because it was not a single narrative upon which everyone was agreed. However, in terms of healing, what we thought was that there was agreement even within the policing community that many of the men who were arrested and then prosecuted and then lost their jobs, and many of whom never worked again, were overall treated in a disproportionate manner. The most common crime was breach of the peace. And the most common penalty was a fine. There were far more serious things happened in England, where there were deaths and criminal prosecutions for deaths. But in Scotland, that was the most common crime that people were arrested for and then prosecuted for. And despite that, the National Coal Board sacked many miners, most of them, and in Scotland the rate of dismissal seemed to be higher than in the rest of the United Kingdom, and there was talk of blacklists, but it was certainly clear that many of these men lost pensions, they lost years of work. Some were able to find other work, some were unable to find other work, and looking at the impact on those individuals as part of their communities, it was clear to us that the overall impact on individuals who had been convicted of mostly relatively minor crimes was wholly disproportionate. And that is why our single recommendation was for a pardon, with details to be worked out later on, but working on the basis that the main example was a man convicted of breach of the peace, fined a fairly small amount, but a man who'd never been in trouble before or since, and who may well have certainly lost his job in mining, and may well have lost any future career. And that was wrong, it was unfair, it was disproportionate, and that was acknowledged fully to us by police officers at all levels to whom we spoke. So that's what we wanted to address. And so our single recommendation was that there should be pardons for minors, certainly those in that situation. There's been discussion since, and that's been expanded in terms of the types of crime, but the government accepted our recommendation, and there is a bill going through the Scottish Parliament just now. It's hoped that it will be brought into law next year. There's some further consultation going on at the moment, but the bill was well and widely well received across the political parties in Scotland. People recognised that there was a serious impact on communities and on the individuals in communities, and that what had happened was disproportionate and could not be excused or ignored. I look back on this as one of the most interesting experiences of my career in or out of the law. I brought to the process my experience as a lawyer, but I also brought to it the human quality of listening, and the things I heard affected me and moved me greatly. And I felt a sense of privilege in having men and women share their stories, and that's whether they were from mining communities or policing communities. I heard some very sad things, I heard some inspiring things, and I heard things that will stay with me, and many of which are recorded in our report. The significance of the process, well, just last night I was speaking to Dennis Canavan, one of my colleagues on the review team, and he'd been invited to speak at a miners' lunch this weekend. I have seen the reaction of miners who know now that they will be pardoned, and there is for them an enormous sense of relief. There's a happiness that it's brought, albeit it can't repair all of the damage. And there is this strong sense that many men who felt that they had lost their good name through doing what they thought was right, never in trouble before, never in trouble since, many of those men feel that they got their good name back. And that is the lasting legacy of it. And they then, within their own communities, feel that that's been recognised, that the wrong, the harms caused to them and their families and their communities have been recognised. And that with the assistance of the contribution from the policing communities, those two communities, which were both badly affected by the strike, have maybe moved a little closer together, as they recognised in reading what we captured, the awful experiences that not only they and their own colleagues suffered, but those all round in the dispute suffered. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to share my thoughts on the review. I wish you well in your similar work in France, and if there is anything else I can do to help, and perhaps at some point come to France and speak to you in person, then I look forward to doing that. Au revoir.